rough journey with the real Joseph. That's what I decided to call the message for today. And so, Darlene, you will see how this fits in with what you just shared with us. Let me ask you a question. Have you heard the saying, heroes or zeros? Who's heard that? A few of you. Okay, you know what I mean by that. Those of you who raise your hand. Nowadays, they often will say he's a hero, or on the other side, he's a zero, and they compare that. I haven't seen it maybe in the last few years, heroes or zeros. And I wanted to ask you a question as we start, get your attention. Does anybody recognize this lady? She just passed away last year at the age of 81, and I got an intentionally early picture. Who wants to take a guess?
Is she the one on the bus?
Rosa Parks? No. But she was one of that kind of heroes. Her name was Winnie Mandela. Anybody heard of Winnie Mandela? About more hands are going up now. Her husband was named whom? Nelson Mandela. She died last year, and she's from, of course, my home country, South Africa. And she was feted, is the word, F-E-T-E-D, with that little stroke on it, recognized, celebrated as the mother of the nation. And a lot of people were saying a lot of things about her. But as happens at funerals or memorial services, they call it, there's a eulogy. Does anybody know what the word eulogy where it comes from? It comes from two words. Logos, which is words, and eu, which means good. These are good words. And at funerals, almost always, they only speak good words. You know what I mean? Although I was at a funeral about 10, 15 years ago when I couldn't believe it, I asked people to share, and they shared the strangest things about the guy who we were burying that day. It was weird. And I stood there. This was an Adventist church. And I thought, what is this? But you know what happened? Everybody knew the guy. And they knew they couldn't just share these good words because he was a little strange fellow. And he did some weird things. I was like the first Sabbath, I think I'd arrived in that church as the new pastor, or the first month, and I was like, I happened to know the guy, and I knew they were telling the truth about him. They weren't going to just gloss over everything, and they told about, and eventually people relaxed, and they had a wonderful time remembering both sides of whatever his name is, Robert or Roberto, but it wasn't a eulogy. However, when it came to Winnie Mandela, they just gave positive things. Later on the radio, I heard a discussion saying, it's not fair. Her legacy is a mixed legacy. Because she had a soccer club called United Football Club, and it was really a group of terrorists that she was in charge of that terrorized people who didn't agree with her. And she was arrested and put in jail. Well, she was arrested and found guilty. 6-year term. Found guilty. Later on, they appealed the case, and she got suspended sentence. But she had this group of enforcers, they called. But at the funeral, everybody spoke the good stuff. You know how it goes, okay? Now, the problem is we don't like to have our heroes with any taints on them. Are you with me? We love to have them perfect. Anybody recognize this lady? Another hero or heroine passed away 20 years ago in a terrible car crash in Paris. Lady Diana. You didn't recognize her. That was before she met Prince Charles. That was before all the makeup and all the other stuff. I found an early picture of her. I thought you wouldn't be able to. That is Lady Di again. Everybody feted and just made a lot of good stuff. I wasn't a Lady Di fan like my wife was, but I decided to buy a book and read on her story. And there I read a book, 500-600 pages about her. And I found out that there were two sides to Lady Diana. On the one side, she was a thoughtful, kind person, but on the other side, you don't want to know the rest of the story. Oh, no. It's devastating when you hear that your hero has a dark side as well. Okay? See if anybody recognizes this man. Immediately, I heard many of you say, who? James White. Yes, that's right, James White. And I was like, why did you put his picture, Pastor? Well, here's the rest of the story. Few people are aware. If you read about, he was also considered, and he's one of the 3 founders of the Adventist Church. But about 35 years ago, I was at Andrews, and I was doing some research, and I read an article, and I thought, that doesn't make sense. It was an article written by somebody who was trying to cover up for James White. Because of what he had said, and I went and I found what he had actually said, And I went to the White Estate and I said, wait a minute, here are the facts. And they said, well, the man who wrote it was trying to, didn't want the family to feel bad. And kind of covered the facts, and they said, but yes, this is true. We'll take it now and we'll rewrite the history to have the actual evidence. And it was surprising. People don't like to hear bad news about their heroes. That's the reality of us as human beings. We love the glorified, glitzified, glossed over stories, either a hero or a zero, but we forget that we are human beings that struggle in life. And unfortunately, we try to do that with everyone, whether it's political or whether it is even in the church. It's a strange thing. So when we go to the Bible, we have to seriously open and start digging. In fact, when I told somebody what I was planning to preach about today, the person said, well, you ruined the story for Esther for us. I'm paraphrasing. You may as well do that. So today, I'm asking you to look seriously at the Bible and see what the Bible teaches. Because Bible biographies, they are the best value. As an educator, no part of the Bible is of greater value than are its biographies. These biographies differ from all others in that they are absolutely what? True to life. True to life. And the thing is, we as human beings, we like to put our heroes on a pedestal. And we try to ignore the rest. And so today it's going to be a rough journey. Are you ready? But before I get to the rough journey, I have a friend who wrote a book about Joseph. And this is what he actually said about Joseph. Well, I'm a little ahead of my story here. But let me just give you a background before we get to my friend. Joseph lived in Egypt with his brothers until he died. You know the story. At the age of 110, Joseph lived long enough to see Ephraim's children and grandchildren. Okay, Ephraim was, question, his oldest son or his second son? It's a tough question. Who was born first of Joseph's sons? Manasseh. But when Jacob was going to give the blessing, what did he do? Remember the story? He crossed his arms. and Joseph said, no, Dad, it's the other way around. The right hand is Manasseh. He needs to get the birthright blessings. And Jacob said, no, I'm intentionally doing that because I'm going to place Ephraim ahead of Manasseh. And so that's why we often speak about Ephraim and Manasseh. That's the Ephraim that's being talked about here. But you know what's interesting? As I was reading my Bible a few years ago, I came across as an astounding statement about Ephraim's kids. Did you know about Ephraim's children? Who knows about Ephraim's children? It's a sad story. And now, if Joseph lived to see Ephraim's children and grandchildren, then very likely Joseph knew this story. Okay. How did Joseph's grandchildren die? Ephraim had two other sons, Ezer and Eliad, but they were killed when they what? Tried to steal livestock from the people who lived in the territory of Gath. How many of you knew that story? I didn't expect any hands, but one hand. Wow, it's in the Bible. Joseph's grandkids were cattle thieves. Did you know that? Wow. Ephraim mourned for his sons a long time, and his relatives came to comfort him. Probably Joseph too. Okay. Sometime later, his wife gave birth to another son, and Ephraim named him Beriah because he was born during a time of misery. Wow, so here, just a reminder, read the Bible. Find out sad stories as well. Wow, Joseph's grandkids were cattle rustlers. Nice term for cattle thieves. Livestock thieves. And when I read that about 5 years ago, I said, how come I never saw that before? I'd read the Bible through and I'm like, okay. Well, you know, part of the reason we come to church is to learn new things, right? Okay. Now, what do we make of this? Obviously, Joseph had heartbreak in his family. Joseph struggled. So, by the way, this is maybe the second time or third time in my life I'm preaching this on the rough part of Joseph's story. Because we all love to have Joseph on the pedestal. So today, put your seatbelts on and let's get into the Word. Because it may be a little rocky, the ride. Just to be aware of that. Because here is some information that almost everybody here never heard. Joseph's grandsons were cattle thieves and got killed in stealing the cattle. Okay. This is what a friend of mine wrote about Joseph in a book that got published. He says this. What kind of a man was Joseph? This is the normal, glossified view of Joseph. In the preceding stories of Genesis, the focus has been on God's faithfulness. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob repeatedly fell short of God's expectations, though, of course, they continue to have faith in him, in God. But, this is what my friend claimed, in the Joseph story, we do not see him fail in any area. The biblical record presents not a single instance of moral or spiritual compromise. As I said, this is a friend of mine. I worked with him in Michigan many years ago. He's now working overseas. But this is what he says. He never failed. Now, what's interesting, I put the word really there. Really? I added really. Okay, Joseph's character issues. What's interesting, John Calvin, well-known Protestant reformer, in his commentary on Genesis claims that, quote, Joseph's dissimulation, that's a nice big word for lies, when he met his brothers on their first trip to Egypt, this is what Calvin says, was joined with a falsehood. And Calvin says that Joseph suffered from human infirmity, was not without fault, told many falsehoods, and sinned grievously. That's John Calvin's opinion. Is John Calvin correct? Oh, okay. So it's a huge challenge. The one guy, my buddy, says Joseph never sinned. John Calvin says he sinned grievously. Oh, do you want to see what the answer is? We're going to go into the Bible, Joseph's character issues. But there's a very important lesson because of that. I'm not here to simply knock down an idol, as they say, or attack Joseph's character. The issue is, what issues did he have? Just to remind you, we shared this in this church before. By the way, I've done 3 sermons positively speaking about Joseph. And now, today, is a little rough journey. Are you ready? This is the rough journey with the real Joseph, with a very important lesson. Notice what Patriarchs and Prophets, page 213, paragraph 2 says. His father, Joseph's father, Jacob, had done him wrong by his partiality and indulgence. Faults had been encouraged that were now to be corrected. This is the time that Joseph was being taken into slavery. This is the time frame. He, Joseph, was becoming self-sufficient. That is, and I went back and checked the dictionary to understand, we don't use these terms much anymore, even proud and exacting, that is, incessantly severe in making demands. Interesting. Now, so that's when he was taken into prison, into slavery, and that's why I call that sermon Providential Pitfall. Now was the time he had to work on these character challenges that were being formed because his father had spoiled him. And by the way, this is a very important thing for parents, grandparents. I know of a person, by the way, I've met not too long ago, that was spoiled as a child. And that person grew up, never got disciplined, never. And I heard this from a relative, never got disciplined. And that person is still, even though she is now advanced in years, is the nice way I can put it, a senior or a seasoned person, she still pouts if she doesn't get her way. Okay? Because of the influence of the parents, and she had never grown out of it, she'd never developed, but unfortunately. So sometimes how parents and grandparents help or don't help their children has a long-term effect. Now, interesting comment. I went to the book called 2SM, Selected Messages, volume 3SM, page 352, says this. Look at Moses and the prophets. Look at Daniel and Joseph and Elijah. Look at these men and find me one sentence where they ever claimed to be sinless. The very soul that is in close relation to Christ, beholding his purity and excellency, will fall before him with shamefacedness. Interesting statement. They never claimed to be sinless. Why do some people, human beings now, centuries later, claim certain people were sinless? Interesting. So we have to go back and ask, what does the Bible teach? Not what do we bring in, I call it sometimes a Hollywoodized version of the Bible. And that's the danger. So we've got to go back and study the Bible to see what Scripture teaches. A quick reminder, some pictures. Pharaoh, of course, we ended our last time, we were talking about Joseph in prison. Pharaoh has a dream, just to remind you. He talks to his attendants and nobody can describe it to him. Suddenly the butler remembers, oh yes, there was this man in prison with me. He told of my dream. And then they bring Joseph out quickly and he comes to Pharaoh. Pharaoh tells the dreams that he's had. You know the story in the Bible, I'm reminding you. And he tells both dreams and then Joseph goes ahead and explains it to the Pharaoh. Now open your Bibles to Genesis 41, verse 16. We'll pick up the story, and remember there's an important reason for this rough journey with the real Joseph. very important lesson today. Now you'll notice there's no handout. I said to myself, I'm not going to give them a handout to take home bad news. But there's a lesson, a very important lesson today. Chapter 41, verse 16 picks up the story when the Pharaoh says, can you interpret the dream for me? He asks the question. In verse 15, the Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream. There's no one who can interpret it. Genesis 41:15. But I have heard it said of you that you can understand a dream to interpret it. Notice verse 16. This is the point here. Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Joseph is right. He points to God. So, okay, this is so. And then, of course, the Pharaoh is so impressed that he says, okay, Joseph, I'm going to make you the ruler. And, of course, he is given a chariot and a new name, etc. And Joseph then begins to lead out in the putting together things. He was basically second in command, as we say. I love the artist's impression here, what they've drawn, bringing all the food, putting it in these huge silos, etc. And so Joseph was doing that. But now let's switch the story, because you remember that his brothers, we've told that already, his brothers came along to him. So open your Bibles now, and we're going to look at when the brothers arrive. What happens? Chapter 42. So go with me now to 42, verse 7. Specifically, I want us to reflect on what happens when the brothers arrive. Chapter 42, verse 7. Then Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he did what? Acted as a stranger to them. The New English translation says it this way. He pretended to be a stranger to them. Okay, you get the idea? He pretended. Interesting. That's verse 7. Go with me into verse 9. Then Joseph remembered the dreams which he had dreamed about them and said to them 3 words, you are spies. Quick question. Was that true? Did he know it wasn't true? Yeah. Interesting. So let's think about that. Wait a minute. You are spies. Now, by the way, I do know there are some people, and I've got it in my bag. I'm not going to read through. People say, he did it for a good reason. It was a facade. It was a charade. It was... Wait a minute. If a good reason justifies what we do, then the end justifies the means. He did. I'm not doubting he did it for a good reason. I'm not doubting it. I know he was probably trying to find out whether baby brother Benjamin was still alive. Okay. So he's trying to find out. I'm not questioning the motive. I'm saying, what were the actions? Verse 9, he pretends. Go with me to verse 12. He said to them, no, but you have come to see the nakedness of the land. Next accusation. Down to verse 14. Joseph said to them, it is as I spoke to you. You are spies. Verse 16, send one of your brothers. Let him return. Go back. Bring your brother. And you shall be kept in prison, that your words may be tested to see whether there is any truth in you, or else by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies. Again, that's obviously the reason he was doing it. We're not questioning why. He was trying to find out if Benjamin was alive, because they said, we have a brother. Well, is he alive? He was wondering, obviously. Remember how they had treated him before? So this is now the challenge. Go with me down to verse 21. He said, the brothers are talking amongst themselves now. They said to one another, we're truly guilty concerning our brother. Talking about Joseph, they're remembering the challenge. For we saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear. Therefore, this distress has come upon us. So they are reflecting, they are struggling. Wait a minute, we're getting payback. Not knowing that Joseph is the very brother they sold into slavery. The irony of the story, because we know the backstory. Verse 23. But they did not know that Joseph understood them, for he spoke to them how? Through an interpreter, through a translator. So they had no idea. Interesting. So this is what's happening, and Joseph, the artist's impression, is accusing them now. Okay, and you know the story, how they went back home. And these are the verses we've already looked at, verses 7 to 9, etc. And of course, on their way home, they open the bag, and in the bag is what? The money. In one sack. And when they get home, they find that every one of their sacks has the money in. So they are now afraid. They come back, return. This is the second trip now. Chapter 43, we pick up the story. And in chapter 43, we find out what he's doing now. So they, of course, you know the story. They ate together. We'll just briefly reflect. There's some lessons I want to share with you as we go along. And then they hid At Joseph's command, the special golden cup was hidden in whose bag? Benjamin. Okay, open our Bibles. You may have forgotten that, so let's go up. Chapter 44. Let's pick up chapter 44, verse 1. This is Joseph commanded, chapter 44, verse 1, the steward of his house, saying, fill the men's sacks with food, as much as they can carry, and put each man's money in the mouth of his sack. Also put my cup, the silver cup, in the mouth of the sack of the youngest and his grain money. Nothing wrong in that per se. But when they had gone, verse 4, let's go to verse 4. When they had gone out of the city and were not yet far off, Joseph said to his steward, now notice the language, get up, follow the men, and when you overtake them, when you catch up, say to them, why have you repaid evil for good? Is that true? No. Wait a minute. What is Joseph doing? Fascinating, scary story. Some have suggested, notice, some have said, one of the challenges Joseph faced was that he had gotten into a position of power. And you know the old saying? Power corrupts. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. He was in a position of power. And now he knows what he can do, and he can play them like marionettes or puppets. So he's in the power, and he says, what have you done? Verse 5, is not this, he's telling them to tell the steward, challenge these brothers of mine, or these Hebrews, is not this the one from which my Lord drinks, and with which he indeed practices divination? You have done evil in so doing. You have done evil. And he practices what? Divination. Interesting. He claims, now we don't believe he was doing, but he was claiming to have supernatural powers. Serious things. And of course they go and they catch him and they bring him back, etc. You know the story. And then when they come back, go with me now to verse 15. Joseph speaking himself. Joseph said to them, what deed is this that you have done? Did they do anything? No. Did you not know that a man such as I can certainly practice divination? Wow, is that true? No. So, by the way, this is a shock to some people. It's like, wow, I didn't know the side of Joseph. Oh. What do we do with Joseph? What do we do with this Joseph? I want you to think about this for a moment. You see, this is the thing as human beings. We have to rethink our Bible stories. We've got to go back and study it again. Remember the question I asked some time before. I'm asking it again some months ago. What is the definition of a lie? An intention to deceive is what constitutes falsehood. Even the statement of fact in such a manner as to mislead is falsehood. Those brothers honestly believed what Joseph was doing, because when they went home the first time, they said to their dad, the man was very cruel to us. Remember that? Spoke harshly to us. They believed what he had got them to believe. Interesting. Now again, I'm not questioning Joseph's motives. Remember, motives are between God and humans. God is the judge of motives. We're only talking about the actions. The actions are very troublesome. And when you look at the actions, it seems as though John Calvin was right. As much as we hate to admit it, John Calvin says he had many falsehoods and sinned grievously. Fascinating. Scary. Wow. Pastor, why did you do this with our favorite story of Joseph? There's a reason. There's a reason. I'll keep you in suspense. Oh. Go with me now to the end of the book. Genesis chapter 50. I want to show you something fascinating. Now you can understand a little bit about the challenge of what Joseph did. And his brothers had learned they couldn't trust him. Think about that. That's the reality. When you get to chapter 50, by the time, of course, you know so much of the story, when he revealed himself, they went home, they told their dad came back. Now chapter 50, verse 15. See, and you can see the results when you do these things to people. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, perhaps Joseph will hate us and may actually repay us for all the evil we did to him. So this is now 15, 20 years later. They're afraid. Now that dad has died, they concluded, naturally, Joseph behaved himself while dad was around. We can't trust this guy. He played us before. Was he playing us again? Are you with me? He confused us. He lied to us repeatedly before. We believed it for years. Before he came back the second time, there's an estimate 2 years. Now dad is dead. Was he playing again? Was he masquerading? They're not sure. This is the danger when we fudge, for whatever reason, it may be so-called good reasons. The danger is they didn't trust him. Later on, they didn't know what to do with him. So they sent messengers. They didn't even go in person. They sent messengers to Joseph saying, before your father died, he commanded, saying, thus, verse 17, you shall say to Joseph, I beg you, please forgive the trespass of your brothers and their sin, for they did evil to you. Now, please forgive the trespass of the servants of the God of your father. Now, it's interesting. They were so uncertain. Just imagine, by the way, we know that Jacob had come there at the age of 130. He died at 147. So they had been there for 17 years. And in those 17 years, apparently they were living in some kind of a thankful, Dad is alive, Dad is dead, now what's Joseph going to do? Wow. This is the danger when we are not honest, forthright, and we manipulate. They didn't trust him. But fortunately, the story's not over. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also went and fell down before his face. And they said, behold, we are your servants. We're willing to be your slaves. And Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? Unfortunately, they didn't know him because he had played too many of these tricks, as some people call it. But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it what? God meant it for good. God meant it for good. In order to bring about, as it is this day, to save many people alive. By the way, there's another issue, and I don't even want to get into it. As many of you are aware, Joseph married the daughter of a pagan priestess. You're aware of that? And I didn't raise it. One day I was speaking doing a lesson study, and there were a lot of Adventist professors, and somebody brought that to my attention, and they said, but you know, there's a Jewish tradition that Asenath became a Jewish believer later on. It's a tradition. It's a theory about Asenath. There's no evidence that she actually joined the Hebrew faith. He married outside. We know he had those two kids, and Ephraim's sons were the cattle thieves. And what happens is, we know sometimes the influence of parents and grandparents. So we don't know what happened exactly, but we do know that he married the wife of the priestess. And there's no evidence in Scripture that she ever came to the Lord. I know this is a difficult sermon, but I want to share with you a very important principle on understanding Bible stories and why I wanted to share this message today. We're coming to that. Biblical narrative, written by Grant Osborne, he put it correctly, is replete, saturated with realistic figures, notice, seen in all their what? Human frailty. God, very important line, God, not the biblical heroes, is magnified throughout. This next sentence is important. Every victory wrought is a triumph of God and of the faith of those who place their trust in him. Now, at this time in Joseph's life, and by the way, there's another passage I didn't even read where Joseph says to his brothers, go home and tell them, and I quote now, of all my glory in Egypt. Did you know about that passage? Yes, this is Joseph. So the challenge of Joseph, this is a rough journey with Joseph. In case you say, where is that pastor? I'll give you the verse. Some of you, I had to hunt for it myself. It's chapter 45, verse 13. So you tell my father of all my glory in Egypt. Like, what was happening to Joseph? Oh, okay, Joseph, it appears, used all this information, a nice word, lied, false accused, all kinds of things he did, pride, married. People say, oh, but the Pharaoh gave him the wife. He didn't have to accept it, you know that. But all of these things, but the good news is this. The good news is this. God, right in the middle, not the biblical heroes, is magnified throughout. You see, one of the things I have found happening in many times, we as Christians, we put human beings, Joseph on the pedestal as though he is the paragon of perfection. All right? We put other heroes on these pedestals, and yet that's not biblical. Who is the only example we should be following? Jesus Christ, that's right. And so the danger is, and by the way, children's stories are wonderful, but sometimes we forget that the story is to point children not to Joseph, not to Esther, not to any other human being, but to Jesus Christ. So that's a challenge for all of us, and myself included. It's like, wow. And I was shocked when I found this out about Joseph. Oh, and I hope you aren't discouraged today. Because this is truth. Truth is to wake us up. Truth is to help us. So go with me now in your Bibles. I want to take you to that important passage in the book of Peter. Peter, who was the most bombastic, enthusiastic, outspoken. And he talks about who our example is. So I want you to go with me now to 1 Peter and chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21. I want to remind you, because this is so important. When we look at Bible characters, we are not to have the characters. The only Bible character worthy of emulation is Jesus. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21. For to this you were called, because whom? Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow whose steps? His steps. And so that's why this is an important message. Remember, I'm not trying to downgrade Joseph. I'm trying to help all of us realize I am thankful to serve a merciful God who is willing to work through me and through you. Despite our follies and our failings and our foibles. I love the way this statement is put here in the book called Faith and Works, page 43. Neither Joseph, Daniel, nor any of the apostles claim to be what? Without sin. Men who have lived nearest to God have acknowledged themselves to be what? Sinners, unworthy of his great favors. They have felt their weakness and what? Sorrowful for their sins, have tried to copy the pattern, Jesus Christ. So I know it's been a rough journey with Joseph, but folks, the pattern for Joseph was whom? Was Jesus. The facts of the Bible sometimes are more scary than the fiction that we may have believed. The facts give us courage. The facts encourage us. The Bible is the Word of God pointing to the Lamb of God. Be careful. I know sometimes when I share these sermons, I realize I have shattered what I call Uncle Arthur's bedtime story version. Now, by the way, I knew Uncle Arthur's son. He was one of my favorite professors. His name is Mervyn Maxwell. And his adoptive son is still a friend of mine to this day. His name is Stanley Maxwell. But the stories that we find in the Bible, we've got to remember, I challenge and encourage us, read the Bible, grow beyond. The bedtime stories are wonderful. I don't want to minimize that. I praise God for those bedtime stories. I'm thankful for those bedtime stories. Are you with me? The bedtime stories were for the kids level. But as Paul says, we should move beyond what's called the soy milk of the Word, for those who are vegans. Okay? The milk of the Word. We must move beyond that. We must get into the veggie meat of the Word. Okay? You follow what I'm saying? So I want to challenge you. Move beyond simply reading the stories from that simple Bible, the bedtime Bible stories we had. Because, brothers and sisters, I want to leave you with one thought. The Bible is about Jesus. He is the only one worthy of being followed. I know it's been a rough journey with Joseph today, but how many of you, by God's grace, want to focus on Jesus and live for him? Holy Father, bless us. Help us to follow Jesus. And I pray that each one will go back and re-study these Bible stories for themselves and realize you are a merciful God, willing to work through us for the salvation of others, despite our failings, despite our faultiness. You love us, you work through us. Help us to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus. In his name I pray.